I'm Dr. Kerry McInerney. Dr. Eleanor Drage and I are the hosts of the Good Robot podcast. Join us as we ask the experts, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism help us work towards it? If you want to learn more about today's topic, head over to our website, www.thegoodrobot.co.uk, where we've got a full transcript of the episode and a specially curated reading list by every guest. We love hearing from listeners, so feel free to tweet or email us, and we'd also so appreciate you leaving us a review on the podcast app. But until then, sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. In this episode, we talk to Aisha Sobey, a research fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Aisha shows us how anti-fat bias, or structural discrimination against fat people, manifests across our digital lives, from health and medical technologies through to the representation of fat people in generative AI tools. She explains why anti-fatness needs to be considered intersectionally, with and alongside other forms of discrimination, why fat liberation offers us a crucial alternative to this harmful status quo, and how fat liberation can be baked into AI design and development. We hope that you enjoy the show. Well, thank you so much for joining us. So just to kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what brings you to the topics of feminism, gender, and technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Aisha Sobey. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. My work has been focused throughout Masters and PhD on how technologies shape what we consider as normal and how this impacts people. And I'm focusing now on how, in particular, this relates to the body and the way we exist as as humans, which is all very grand, but sort of embedded within a fat liberation perspective. And this absolutely brings me or goes hand in hand with feminism, gender and technology, because feminism and gender has been and the body has been a site of contestation for a very long time. So I would be doing the topic a disservice without thinking about all of these things.
Incredible. Thank you so much. And we're really excited to have your take on our 3 good robot questions. So what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism help us get there? And I know that you use technologies in your day-to-day life to monitor your health, and I'd be really interested in what a good technology is on the micro level for you.
Yeah. Absolutely. So to add context to that, I'm a type 1 diabetic. I'm actually very recently moved onto a pump. So my life is now even more technologically mediated by algorithmic and technological systems. So I think from both the fat liberation perspective and the diabetic person perspective on the micro end, for me, good technology is something that starts from a plural perspective as opposed to a singular what is desired or good or created. So I think in terms of that being possible, the jury is still out, because for me, a background in political economy, the financial interest in having something singular that everyone should spend money trying to attain the drive for that is so strong that challenging that and moving away from that is really hard. But I'd like to think it's really possible, because and just say that that's not necessarily a very individual perspective of everyone should be allowed to do whatever they want through technology, but moving towards values and positive values that, again, they're opinion-based and societal, culturally based. This is where feminism, I think, would be a really great starting point. All these things have been thought about for a very long time. Community, care, the ethics of care, and how these can feed into the technological systems in their design from a start point. That to me makes it possible, but someone's got to fund that. So the jury's out.
Can I ask how your heat pump is going?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wait, I'll ask that again, because it's not a heat pump.
I was going to say, I love a good bit of central heating too.
I'm so sorry. No, my boyfriend's installing a heat pump in his house. It's like this, you get these government incentives to do it, and he's just going on and on and on about it. So I'm really sorry. How is your pump going? Tell us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a really weird one, because I think even a researcher, where we think about AI hype all the time and how it's so ridiculous, I still was hoping that this technology and this sort of change from doing injections myself to this AI would, revolutionize my life and take all of the burden away from me and all of the thought. And actually, and that, thinking about it, it was very naive. So the kind of And I think this is where the kind of the building for normal and building for like one specific person comes in from my kind of like academic research, my world of meeting, in the sense that like the algorithm that runs the loop technology, which is where the sort of the sensor for blood sugar talks to the insulin delivering pump and theoretically performs as the pancreas. The idea in our training sessions was that like, oh, and when you women have a have a hormonal time of the month when, you'll know that you'll be running higher, you need to tell the algorithm that, and you need to kind of like, add that in. So it's like already the default human is one that does not have that going on for them. And then the other default human is the one that has the cycle that's regular and that you know that it's happening and all of these things, which like, I think recent studies have shown 28-day illusion of period cycles happens for about 30% of people, if not of people with uteruses, if not less. So there's so many assumptions built into what is normal that it's astounding, because I'm like, okay, great. So as someone with other hormonal things going on, there is no way that this algorithm is really going to help me with that aspect of this care. Which is a very long answer, but yeah.
No, but I think it's a really illuminative one, in part because what you were saying really reminded me of one of our previous episodes with Helen Hester, who is a feminist theorist of technology and labor in many different ways, but with a particular expertise in care work. And I remember when we did a live episode for the podcast, so if you're listening to this, definitely check it out. Something Helen talked about was how new medical technologies offer this promise, as you've said, of making medical care so much easier. And in practice, what they do is that they move medical care out of the hospital and into the home, and they individualize this medical care, and they force people to become their own sort of medtech experts and their own carers. And this is often sold as this dream of greater autonomy. And I'm sure there's a lot of really great reasons why people want to have their medical care at home rather than in the hospital. But it also, she says, puts an incredible burden on carers in the home. And often home carers tend to be women who tend to be doing this work unpaid, to have to technologically upskill, but also take on a lot of work that is emotionally and physically really, really challenging that they just might not have had to do before. And so what you're saying around this pump as well, I know it's not exactly equivalent because you had to previously do the injections anyway, but I feel like there's something in that sort of at-home professionalization there.
And there's a real tension, because as the person who has the chronic health condition, from disability studies, there's lots of us that talk about kind of like, we know our own bodies, listen to us, listen to this, like, us be experts in our own kind of health. Actually, the kind of, sometimes the recognition of that through technology then means that there's then a kind of like a dual burden of being the one that is responsible for like producing a nice looking graph for the doctor to kind of interpret. And it's like, for people who can't do that or don't want to do that, or for whatever reason, that then creates additional barriers to care that are really problematic or could be really harmful.
Absolutely. And I, wanted to actually ask you about another sort of really specific angle of your work, which is the one that you spoke about at the beginning of this episode, which is the fat liberationist approach to technology and technology design. And that, of course, includes healthcare, because this is a place where anti-fat bias, I think, is particularly prevalent and just very, very influential, but also percolates into so many different areas and spheres of life. But first, I want to ask you about anti-fat bias. So what is anti-fat bias? Why do you prefer anti-fat bias as a term compared to other terms like fat phobia, which are often commonly used in the media? And what does it mean? How does it manifest across digital systems and technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. Big questions. I'll try and be succinct. I think anti-fat bias is the negative attitudes, or we all hold implicit and explicit biases. We all have things we favor. The anti-fat bias being specifically negative attitudes around weight and body size. And this, I'm going to keep using the word fat as in line with lots of other activist spaces that have reclaimed language that has previously been harmful. And similarly, you have the idea of fat phobia, whilst I think people have moved away from that in the sense that in lots of kind of, again, in lots of activist movements, the idea of calling something a phobia can be quite problematic, because phobias they're a real condition. And it also sometimes like minimizes the idea of what a phobia is. Anti-fat bias at a systemic level is a lot more powerful to think about, as opposed to fat phobia, which tends to be very, well, you're just a bit fat phobic. It's a very more individualized way of thinking about the problem. And that's not to say anti-fat bias isn't just harmful for fat people, and that there is like real live lived discrimination for people of sort of the bigger you get, the more discrimination there is. But I think we also have to think about it as a systemic thing that harms everyone, in the same way that misogyny can harm men and sort of restrict how men can live. Anti-fat bias can absolutely invade the lives and the heads of people who would be considered sample size. I think that's a real concern, because I think we're really losing generations of young people who are having a lot of energy and thought going towards controlling the size of their body, rather than on things that really matter to them, align with their values, would make them happy. And I think that's really sad. And it happens to women a lot more than men, because we're the ones who tend to have more thoughts go in from society about how our bodies should look and present themselves. And then one final note, there is also weight bias or weight stigma, which tends to come from a more medicalized perspective. So that researchers who've identified that, hey, the healthcare system is really not a very nice place for people who are sort of higher weights, and we have this weight bias going on, but it also tends to be predicated from a place that suggests there is shame and stigma in being mean to fat people, so we should be nice to them so that they can lose weight, as opposed to we should be nice to them full stop. And I think the anti-fat bias place in the position I'm coming from is that we should be nice to everyone full stop.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think it is, really compelling the way that you lay out this case for saying, like, the phobia approach just doesn't work, or really hyper-individualizes. It makes it seem as though it's both a property of an individual person, and it's also another individual that they just dislike or have a fear of. It can naturalize it, when actually these things are so systemically baked in. And so how does that operate across then sort of the digital world or our technologies? Like, where do you see those kinds of structures of anti-fat bias manifesting?
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing me back to that one, Gary. So I think, so this was actually where I sort of started my research journey in this area. So I looked at human-computer interaction, or HCI, as a genre of research. And I looked at the way, so I looked at design justice. Thank you. I looked at design justice as a theory for design, and I noticed that like body size just wasn't in there. There was no reference to kind of like anti-fat bias and body size in design justice toolkits at large. So I then went back to HCI research and some of the like online repositories that like keep all of that together. And I looked for body weight as a term, and I realized that the vast majority of all of HCI research that looks at anything to do with body weight is designed to reduce and make bodies smaller. So I think there were about 4 studies that were talking about body weight in a we need to make bodies smaller way. But beyond that, of like 600 plus studies, they were all trying to reduce the size of people. So I think that's the fact that that's going on under the hood of our design practice in human-computer interaction. That's absolutely a way that it's manifesting in digital systems. And then you have to think about also the recommender algorithms we get through sort of online social media and all of these. Again, the hidden things that we see. And there's been some really good studies showing just how the societal push to be thin comes out absolutely in the ads that we get seen, especially starting to be targeted towards women. And we're seeing this more and more with as Ozempic and various weight loss drugs are coming onto the market. The targeted advertising, that yes, it might have people paying attention, but it's also causing or supporting lots of eating disorders, lots of dissatisfaction with body image for lots of people. So I think that the structures that we're in are towards making bodies smaller. So yeah.
It seems to me that you're saying that anti-fat bias is bad for everybody, because it's not necessarily targeted towards specific people so much as this idea of weight that has become a phantasm in society that people are afraid of. I want to ask you about the other side of this. So fat liberation, that I also believe is good for everybody. So what is fat liberation?
Yeah. So fat liberation was a movement that started with the fat dyke movement, actually, in the 60s and 70s. In 1973, there was a manifesto published that sort of set out, I think, 11 points saying we are against reducing industry, we are against the exploitation and the selling of products and services to reduce the size of our bodies, to seeing fat people as a market to be exploited by lots of companies, against the kind of the scientific bias towards reducing body size, and we can debate the healthiness or not of being fat, maybe another time. But the core of the manifesto comes down to this idea that lots of this science is defunct, lots of the science is predicated on really harmful and biased metrics, and lots of the science is also, we've seen it in the 50 years since the manifesto, that no country, despite national projects to reduce people's weight, has seen a reduction in anyone's weight. And studies now longitudinally can show that trying to lose weight is actually a predictor of gaining weight, because over the long term, our bodies don't want to lose weight. Our bodies are geared towards losing weight being a bad thing. So with all of that going on, and sort of we've seen that from the 1970s onwards, to really push against the idea that people should be made smaller. So that then calls for a much recognizing and embracing the idea that fat people can live meaningful, joyful, whole lives, especially when they're not gearing themselves towards making their bodies smaller all the time. Yeah, that's the movement, and there's a movement within HCI, human-computer interaction, to bring this into design paradigms and to look at how this could be enacted in our digital worlds as well.
Tell us about that. How can fat liberation be brought to life in combating the way that AI usually treats people?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So I think there's various different ways of looking at it. So you can, in so many different aspects, this comes into so many different aspects of life. So whether it's being able to information seek about health without weight being a central element to it, or weight loss, whether it's rethinking how we design our kind of like avatars and our gaming systems, that there's an encoded thinness is good and the baddies are going to be fat. There's a kind of a narrative representation in lots of what we see. I don't know if either of you, this is showing my age, but the We Fit movement, where you had your little me, but those guys, depending on the weight that you put in, were bigger, and as you lost weight, they would get thinner. And I think there are lots of these design paradigms that could absolutely be challenged, but it's also moving away from seeing bodies in general as something to be profited from. I think we have maybe this is showing my bias now, but designing health technologies and behavioral change technologies and self-tracking for profit encodes this idea that something needs to be fixed and something needs to change. Because of that, it means that there is a need to keep users on the app, that there's a need to there's a design paradigm that means we want to retain people, we want to keep them, we want their data, we want all of these things from them so that we can make money. And if actually shifting systems away from that towards how can we support someone and then set them free? How can we get as little information from them as possible to still offer them something? I think, we talk about in relationships, if you love someone, set them free. Like if you want to do a really good job as a technology, make it so that no one is dependent on you to move forward. And that especially around weight would be the fat liberational perspective.
Yeah, and I really love that as well, which is that our economic models, right now they're so set on dependency. And like you're saying, what would it mean to really meaningfully actually support people to live full and free and flourishing lives through technology? And so I think something that is really striking about, the fat liberation movement is that it has deep roots in other kinds of justice movement, feminism, racial justice movement, but it also is arguing that anti-fatness is the structure of oppression in and of its own right that needs to be addressed as such. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you think about the relationship between anti-fatness and other kinds of discrimination. Certainly, I think this is something I've thought a lot about from the perspective of race, not only because of the extensive literature that has thought about anti-fatness and anti-blackness, but also because I do think that weight and sort of the politics of weight has played a really substantial role in the formation of stereotypes around model minorities, or certainly I think as a multiracial Asian person, I think a lot of the model minority discourse around Asians in the health sector often does relate to this idea, that Asian people are often smaller or just physically smaller bodies, even though I think this also can lead to really, difficult kinds of health stereotyping that don't necessarily meet the needs then of these racially minoritized communities. So yeah, how do you think about intersectionality or these intersecting power relations in your own approach to anti-fatness and fat liberation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think fat liberation and anti-fat bias are both founded in relation to other forms of marginalization. So if we look at the history of the body mass index, or the BMI, which is a common health metric, you see the origins coming from hierarchies of bodies and power, to sort of say, hey, look, these thin white people are far better than these larger people we're trying to subjugate. We see that in the way that the anti-fat bias began, and then as the average person got created, the founder of the BMI was like, no, this is a population level thing, don't use it for an individual level. But it got popularized by insurance companies, again, who can we charge more to, and at the same time, Galton and his eugenic scientific racism project to sort of say, hey, look, this is another measure at which we can look at certain types of people and say that they're lesser. So I think there's an absolutely shares with ableism and the ideas of the body and maximizing the body for the purpose of being productive. And similarly, fatness has been sort of shown in women to be very masculinizing and in men to be feminizing. So it has to be understood in relation to all these other things. But actually, at the same time, all of those other forms of marginalization, at least according to implicit bias tests from Harvard, are slowly going down as projects around the world are trying to say, hey, look, this is bad. But actually, the implicit bias towards weight, towards fatness, is increasing. So there are absolutely, I think, the functioning of weight bias, whilst it goes hand in hand with lots of our other marginalized groups, it's functioning by itself at the same time. And we're seeing this especially in our medical training and our medical world, where health and access to health is just becoming increasingly difficult for people in higher weight categories, having health care restricted. So for example, people being refused surgeries, being refused treatments because of their body size, being told, lose weight first and then we'll deal with you. When, regardless of their history of eating disorders, regardless of the practicality and the meaningful ways that people could actually do this or not. Yeah, so yes, it absolutely goes hand in hand, but I think it needs calling out the system. And we write academic papers in 5,000 to 8,000 words, and you can only cover so much, whilst a truly intersectional approach to look at how all of these facets go together is really important. There's also, I argue, a need to zero in on fatness to look at how it isn't being designed into systems and how we could design it out.
For sure. And I think, there's so many different strands to what these interlaid systems of power, yet holding their own distinct force behind them. There's so many ways that these manifest. And, I think you've really brilliantly broken down some of the systemic issues around, say, the way this shapes kind of health and medicine. But I know some of your work also focuses on representation. So again, drawing on long histories of social justice and liberation movements, including fat liberation, to think about how fat people are represented within technological systems. And one of those is Gen AI. So I know you did a really big study on thinking about how fatness and fat people are represented in these systems. Could you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kerry. So my most recent study was looking at the way fatness was represented in generative AI image models, especially because these image models are becoming more and more prolific. We're seeing them embedded in various different sort of creative platforms. And even if we want, we can, again, debate the ethics of using them separately. The fact that they are being used really widely needs to be considered, and what type of social norm they are, what type of social imaginary they're proliferating and putting out into the world. So, and we've had some studies on that of kind of the bias that's shown against sort of different gender representation and racial representation. But I figured, hey, let's also talk about fatness. So in a study of 9 different free-to-use platforms, I put in 20 different prompts. 9 of them would be just asking for a person. So a person in their home, a person exercising, a person eating food. For example, generic prompt, as short as possible. It's a good way of having these models show their bias by not predetermining too much. And then the other 11 prompts were a fat person eating a meal, a fat person exercising, a fat person in their home, the equivalent, and then 3 additional prompts of an obese person and a morbidly obese person, just to understand where the medicalized language, or just to see if there was any difference between the medicalized framing versus fat as a reclaimed term. And so I think the first finding that I would argue is really important was that in the prompts that didn't ask for an explicit body size, they all came out really slim. And whilst coming out showing a slim person isn't a problem, the diversity and the restricted body size of only being sample size clothing size or presenting as such creates a real imaginary for a user that that's the type of person that I should be. So it's effectively erasing body size diversity, erasing fatness from this collective imaginary. And then when we look at the ones, when you asked for fatness, some of the models refused to create images if you use the word fat in the prompt. And I appreciate that is likely coming from a kind of a desire to protect against harms, with the idea that fat is a slur. Equally, it would produce things when you asked for obese within sort of fat liberation communities is much more of a harmful term because it implies the need to solve a problem with the fat body. So you had some models that were just like, nope, not doing it. But then you kind of got to models where evidently they produced some things, but it was produced images that were cartoons, even though I was asking for photorealistic the whole time. And in the way that they were produced, you could start there was some really core trends across 7 of the models. It produced a sort of topless male presenting white man for lots of the outputs. Lots of the facial expressions were a lot sadder and sort of more negative compared to the non-fat prompts. And similarly, there were lots more instances of body anomalies, and by that I mean additional, like joke-style additional chins, or split down the middle of the body as if the fat person's body was about to explode, or sort of rolls of fat that become sort of almost worm-like in their appearance. So I think it was a project in kind of seeing quite a lot of quite sad images coming out of these models, and I wonder then if someone is brave enough to ask, hey, I want to see a fat person, I actually want to see this, to then get something so negative coming back out, I think it is really harmful, and it's an area that I would really like to see changed. So I absolutely have to caveat that with, part of me was really happy to not see myself represented, because it meant that images of myself and people like me hadn't been exploited and brought into these very exploitative, haven't been extractivist models. So there's a real reckoning to be done within the sort of plurality of fatness and fat communities to try and see what could be done, both from a like, hey, we need to see diverse bodies, but also what power do we have in not being represented right now as fat people.
Absolutely. And there's always that push and pull. It's a double-edged sword for many different communities that find themselves either invisibilized or represented in a way that makes them too visible. You're doing a great thing by collaborating with the University of Sheffield and creating your own diabetes tracking app that is going to transform this sector by creating a product that actually does good. And so I'm excited to hear about how you imagine this design to be and what kinds of problems you want to solve through designing your own diabetes tracking app.
Yeah, so from pointing at the problems and pointing at the biases in these algorithms, part of my work is then also looked at like what can like genuinely be done? What would this look like if designed differently? So myself and a colleague at the University of Sheffield met over fat liberation and both realised that we're both people living with diabetes. And whilst food tracking, from a sort of a self-tracking perspective, technologically has had a lot of critiques from people like Deborah Lupton to sort of say, hey, look, these are really insidious. They're creating this normative ideal of the body, and self-tracking can be quite harmful, especially in relation to weight. The other research is looking at how they embed normative values and sort of like ideas of the body. We realized that like at the diabetes, which is because there are multiple types, because lots of people with diabetes, lots of co-occurrence with type 2 diabetes is also being fat. It tends to be a really stigmatized condition that is really like fatness, very individualized and very blame-ridden and stigmatized in terms of you have not lived well, which is wrapped up in the fact that diabetes as a condition is based on your pancreas not producing enough or at all any insulin. And insulin is the hormone in the body that moves sugar around the body out of bloodstreams into organs. So part of the management of all types of diabetes is knowing the food that goes in. So inherently, as diabetic people, you have to track food. You have to understand what carbohydrate you're putting in. So we realized there was an area of tension or lack of research around what are the normative values that are in our food tracking landscape doing to users who actually have very little choice as to whether they do this or not. Sort of lots of the kind of response to food tracking is like, well, just don't do it. Like, let go of that. Don't know what you're putting in your body. Eat mindfully, eat intuitively. And that's not necessarily possible from the diabetic perspective. So we wanted to understand that from the diabetic perspective. And we also, from our lived experience, know that there are no apps that are endorsed or created specifically for diabetic people. So we, from that, have decided, and we're working on this project currently, to understand and to work towards building food tracking technology that isn't based on diet culture, that it's very much based on how can we support people who need to know how much carbohydrate is in their food, to know that without necessarily being beholden to numbers like calorie counts and BMI tracking that is just inherently in lots of food tracking apps. So we're in the process of doing that. We've been working with focus groups of diabetic people to understand what would make genuinely good food tracking technology for them, what would reduce the burden of living with the chronic health condition, to be able to go on and actually sort of build the technology. What's been really interesting is the tension that we touched upon earlier between societal expectations of what we should have, and also we're coming from a perspective that what is socially normal is not ideal. So how to do participatory research and have people's voices really included when people's voices may be saying, yes, I want to lose weight. Yes, this is because people have been told all through their healthcare journeys that that is something that they should be doing. So we are currently grappling with that design problem of how do we bring people in whilst also not reproduce this thing that we set out to challenge. And the jury's still out on that one. We're still working on that.
Aisha, I've taken down more notes than I have in any other episode this year. And I love that you talked about how fatness in some way perverts gender norms as well. I thought that was incredibly interesting. We are definitely at time though, so thanks again for coming on, and looking forward to seeing you in the office tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
This episode was made possible thanks to the generosity of Christina Gore and the McArthur Foundation. It was produced by Eleanor Drage and Kerry McInerney, and edited by Eleanor Drage.